Bruxelles, je t'aime. Tu m'avais manqué. Bruxelles, je t'aime. Bruxelles, je t'aime. Tu m'as préféré. Bruxelles, je t'aime. Bruxelles, je t'aime.
Hello there and welcome to Brussels, my love, Euronews' weekly talk show on all the news bubbling here in Brussels and beyond. I'm Maeve McMahon. Thanks for tuning in. Coming up this week, a tale of two elections in two of Europe's most significant countries. In France, almost 7 in 10 voters went to the polls last week after the shortest campaign in history. The winners, the Green Left alliance known as the New Popular Front. The losers, the far-right National Rally. Sandwiched in the middle, French President Emmanuel Macron, who called these snap elections. We hear how Brussels feels about the confusing outcome and if the French economy will survive this political rollercoaster. And the political scene has also changed in the UK. The former EU member that voted to leave the Union back in 2016 has swung to the left. Labour promises to, quote, make Brexit work and rekindle friendships with Brussels. We take a look at how new relations could look and assess if Brexit has been a success or a failure. A warm welcome to our panel this weekend. Klaus Welle, former Secretary-General of the European Parliament, now with the Wilfred Martin Centre, the Chair of the Academic Council. Welcome.
Thank you.
Maria Tadeo, EU reporter and correspondent based here in Brussels. Lovely to have you with us.
Thanks.
And Eric Maurice, our French expert from the European Policy Centre, a policy analyst covering everything going on in France and beyond. Also lovely to have you with us.
Thanks.
But before we bring in your views, let's just hear why Brussels is fretting about the future of France.
What happens next in France is anyone's guess. Recent snap elections raised more questions than answers. The winners were the left-wing alliance, the runners-up Macron's Ensemble, and in third place the National Rally. But with no majority, France is in uncharted waters. President Macron has saved face, just about, but his group lost 1/3 of its seats in the National Assembly. The challenge now is to build a coalition. The victorious New Popular Front promised people more spending power and a lower retirement age, which will do little to close France's ballooning budget deficit. What does this political deadlock mean for France and its constitutional order? And what does it mean for European stability?
So that's the question we're addressing to our panel today. What does this politically weak in France mean for the EU? Klaus Welle.
I think it's a major challenge. People are relieved because we didn't get hostile government, which would have been Le Pen, basically, Rassemblement National, running France. But there are two major dangers which are still there. One is irresponsible government, which means a government which would be run on the program of the extreme left, which would, in fact, as you have said in your introduction, balloon deficits and potentially provoke a financial crisis, but also unstable government, because it seems that all those which have won these elections, they really don't want to provide a stable majority for the country. So it's a little bit too early to be relaxed, and the other two have to be watched, because if there's no stability or if there's unstable government, if there's irresponsible government, it means that we might be back relatively quickly to scenario one, which means a Rassemblement National asking for the power.
And there's one thing we're always saying here on Brussels, my love, people here in this city, they do not like instability. Well, let's just remind our viewers what that assembly could potentially look like. If you take a look again at those outcomes, coming up on front there on top was the Nouveau Front Populaire at 182 seats, followed by Macron's Ensemble with 163. Third in was the RN, Rassemblement National, with 143 seats. And last was the traditional right at 68 seats. Eric Maurice, you've been following this all week. Tell us, the next date we need to look at is the 18th of July, of course, when the Assembly will meet and elect a president.
Yeah, that's what Emmanuel Macron said in a letter this week. He's waiting for the Parliament to have its first sitting and have a look at exactly how the groups are organized, meaning, how many MPs will be for the Socialist Party, for instance, compared to the La France Insoumise of Jean-Luc Mélenchon within this left-wing coalition. That will give an indication of how radical or how irresponsible this coalition would be. We will also have to see how the centre bloc organizes itself between Renaissance, but also two other smaller parties within this centrist bloc. And then we will see, depending on how they organize organize themselves, who can be the leading force for potential negotiations between this left-wing coalition and this centrist bloc, and also what happens with the Republicans, the center-right party, which for now is quite ambiguous about what it wants to do, how close it wants to be with the centrist. So when the Parliament, this Assemblée Nationale meets for the first time, we'll have a clearer outlook of what things could be.
So still a lot of questions that need to be answered. Maria, how has the European press been reacting? What have been the main headlines?
Look, to me, it's very interesting, but I think before we even get into the details of what happens in the next few weeks, I think you have to take a bigger picture look at what happened in the French election. And this was not just a French election. This was an election, as you say, that everyone, you talked about the European media, there was a lot of stake for Europe. And the fundamental question is, if Bardella had been in a position to be prime minister, I think one of the biggest red lines of European politics in the past decades would have been completely obliterated. And that is the idea that there are no government deals with the far right and they do not get in government. So I think the idea of relief obviously really resonated across Europe, across the European media, across the institutions. Clearly, behind the scenes, they would tell you that too off the record. On the record, they cannot, but they would tell you privately it was a relief and a shock and a surprise. But I think there's also an element, frankly, at times, I'm not sure if it's intellectual dishonesty or maybe it's just this idea that the center is holding. But what I do see, however, and this is not just France, but it's across Europe, there is a wave that may not be in government yet, but you look at votes and percentage of votes, there is something fundamental now about parties that get voted repeatedly, and it's not just a protest for vote. I think that is intellectually dishonest to say it's a one-off, because it's not anymore.
And the word you say there, yet, that is a crucial word. Not in government yet, but I mean, all eyes, of course, on the presidential elections in 2027. But just briefly, the party that you're affiliated with, of course, the traditional right in France, have just completely disappeared or fallen apart. What's going on?
They haven't really fallen apart, because they did a surprisingly good result together with some individual members who ran a bit on their own ticket. They will again have in the 60s, which is more or less where they were before. So they do exist, and in fact they might be crucial for any kind of government formation. If you want to build a government which is responsible, which means without the two extremes, on the one hand Le Pen, on the other hand Mélenchon, you need the Republican Party at least to tolerate such an effort.
But you say responsible. The voters don't want responsible. They want more money in their pockets, right, Eric? I mean, that's the problem here.
Well, they want a government that addresses their concerns, but you're right. What does that mean? In France, usually people expect a lot from the state, a lot of spendings. But on the other hand, there was a lot of spending during the COVID pandemic, during the energy crisis. And then people just forgot quickly that there was a lot of money put on the table to help them, and they see now, they just look at the debt and the fact that life is still more expensive. But I think more globally they want change. There was an opinion poll after the vote, and a cloud of words of the motivations of the voters. And for the Rassemblement National, there were very few words. There was immigration, of course, but the big word in this cloud was change. So it's something very unmaterial, very difficult to perceive. It's money, of course, but it's not only that.
And just to go back to the economy, we can bring in actually now a French economist who's been keeping a very close eye on this and the impact, of course, it could have on the Eurozone's second biggest economy. Let's take a listen now to Marc Touati.
Even before the legislative elections and this political crisis, the French economy was already in a particularly bad state. In other words, we have an enormous debt of over 3,150 billion euros. This is obviously an absolute record. France is the country where public debt has increased the most in relation to GDP since 2019, compared with all the countries in the Eurozone. Unfortunately, France is in the process of slipping back into recession in all sectors of activity. We have to be clear that if France ever has a government that announces a further increase in public deficits, then France will marginalize itself from other nations and could even trigger a crisis in the Eurozone. We need to be aware of this. It could obviously lead to a cataclysm in the Eurozone, but also worldwide. It's very reminiscent of the Greek crisis.
Ça rappelle vraiment très étrangement la crise grecque.
Marc Touati there, is he being a bit overdramatic? Maria Tadeo, I mean, I know the euro did drop, didn't it, on Monday morning with the outcome, but...
Well, the Greek crisis, I don't see it, but Is it a systemic country to the euro and the euro area? Of course, and that matters. Again, the one point where I would agree, some of it in my view is a slight exaggeration, but what I would agree is the state of the economy was already being questioned even before the election. You know, I've covered the Eurogroup for many years. I've talked to Bruno Le Maire for many years. The pressure on the French government has been on clearly for at least a year, not just from the institutions. And now we know that the question of the deficit and the GDP is still very much on the table, and politically that is incredibly sensitive. But also look at the credit rating agencies. Of course, you've had 2 downgrades back to back, so this was obviously still on the table, and it's a fundamental question for whatever government takes over.
But if you take a look at the manifesto of the Nouveau Front Populaire, so the left-wing alliance, they have a 24-page manifesto put together which really sees radical reforms in France, like lowering the retirement age to 60, imposing price controls on goods like food, energy and fuel, raising the minimum age and also raising salaries for civil servants. You could see a bit of a collision course here, though, with Brussels when it comes to the excessive debt procedure.
Yeah, I think France is up for a meeting with reality. There's already a deficit of 5.3%. The overall debt is at 112% debt to GDP. We know from this country in Belgium, when you get to 120, 130, you basically lose your sovereignty. You pay debt and you pay interest. And if on these 112% there would be a huge additional pile of debt, and that would be the consequence of the program of the extreme left, which was largely taken over by the left coalition, then I think we would be in serious trouble. And France is simply too big to fail.
Ooh, some hard talk there from Klaus Welle. I mean, that's not exactly what Jean-Luc Mélenchon wants to hear. He was in town this week. He was over in Brussels, or he was over in the European Parliament. He's, of course, the leader of La France Insoumise, France Unbowed. And he was saying everything will be fine.
Yeah, but you said it. Jean-Luc Mélenchon is the leader of La France Insoumise. He's not the leader of this coalition, the left-wing coalition, the New Front Populaire, and he's not the next prime minister. So I think we have to relativize the program. Macron's dissolution was a surprise for everyone. There was 1 week of campaign, 1 month of campaign. This program of the Nouveau Front Populaire was made in 2 or 3 days. So of course they agreed on something very maximalist because LFI was pushing for more to get this left-wing alliance. But they needed this program, this coalition, to do a good result in the election. But now they have to govern. They probably would have to govern, not alone, and they were not prepared for that. So I think the program will have to be watered down, face to reality, but also face to coalition partners, potential partners.
And what's going to happen, Maria Tadeo? Voters will be disappointed.
They could be disappointed, but just going back to that question, this reminds me a lot of the Italian government in 2018. This was an Italian government that was an unexpected coalition. Remember, it was a 5-star movement and the League. They decided to come to Brussels with what some would say wasn't just a maximalist program, but one that really was an open challenge to Brussels. That had been their election campaign, and I covered that. And at the time, I remember the headlines that you hear in the national capitals are very different to what a finance minister would say in Brussels. I also remember the pressure from the markets was enormous. And in the end, you had a solution where the government in some ways had to save face and back down. So there is a reality check that comes with being in government. I would just say, however, what is different this time is that everyone here is positioned to a 2027 election. What is different now is that I'm not sure how many in this coalition want to do a good job that reflects well on Emmanuel Macron and his choice of finance minister, which to me would be fundamental. The person that gets named for that job will be incredibly important.
And as you say, national capitals are, of course, keeping a very close eye on this because we're talking about France here. I mean, huge, very important country. And we want to actually hear how the situation is unfolding in Germany, how people have been digesting the outcome there. So we asked our Berlin correspondent, Liv Schreid, to send us an update.
The German government, including Chancellor Olaf Scholz, announced their relief that the French had swerved a swing to the far right during the French elections. However, Vice-Chancellor Robert Habeck has said he sees an enormous challenge ahead as France scrambles to form a new government. Germany has significant concerns about economic and financial policies if the government decides to rewrite Macron's budget plans. Germany, as the strongest economy in the EU, is jointly liable for other Eurozone countries and would be called upon to step in with guarantees. France is already heavily indebted, and the left-wing coalition made expensive campaign promises, including a rollback of pension reforms that are likely to cause friction on an EU level.
Liv Stride there reporting from Berlin. Maria, you want to react?
To me, this is sort of the blind leading the blind to some extent, because Germany, to be clear, is still the biggest economy, as you mentioned with your correspondent. But in terms of the government and the politics that we see out of Berlin, it is also a very difficult coalition where a lot of the messaging is all over the place. They talk about a debt problem. Clearly, France obviously will be the focus on how to bring down the debt and deficit, but also Germany at this point is not in a position to preach either, because, and I know they hate this. No, but I know they hate this, the idea of the sick man of Europe, but the growth recipe of the country has not changed over the past 3 years. The challenges are enormous, and we still see that the Chancellor has not been able to come up with a model that resonates for the future. So in a way, what you see is that both are weaker, but obviously you like to say the other one is weaker. Just very briefly, and I'd be curious to get your thoughts on this, where we did see that the balance of power may be changing is the top jobs. Everyone was expecting that Emmanuel Macron was going to put a surprise on the table, that he was going to be perhaps able to counterbalance more traditional positions from the Germans, but actually we didn't even hear from him. We didn't really see him. He was very low profile because he just wasn't in that position.
That's the question as well we're always asking ourselves here in Brussels, my love. Is Germany losing its clout as well across the EU?
I think the difference is in Germany you have a temporary problem. There are elections next year, and as it looks now, the centre-right Christian Democrat Union would take over the government. The problem with this government is they have a lot in common on cultural issues more, but not on economics. The socialists and the Greens are on the one edge, and the Liberals are scrambling for their own survival because they need to make the 5% hurdle. They are just at 5.5%. So they have to be very tough. So they can't really come together on economic issues. But next September there are new elections. As it looks now, the Christian Democrat CDU is by far ahead with 30%. Of course, still a long way to go. But
and they did well in Parliament. They did very well as well in the European Parliament election.
They did also 30% in the European election, so I don't think these situations are really comparable. But also on France, maybe just let me add, there was this week a letter by President Macron where he made it very clear nobody has won these elections, nobody has a majority, and therefore the reasonable people have to come together, which means without the extremes.
And of course, Emmanuel Macron will still represent his country at EU councils, but at ministerial levels, different ministers will be defending their beliefs, Eric Maurice, and this could get very complicated.
Well, again, I think we have to wait for what kind of government, what kind of coalition we will have, and I would advise not to get overexcited about, this radical left being in power. It won't happen. This left-wing coalition is made of La France Insoumise, the ecologists, and the Social Democrats. La France Insoumise is not the main party within this coalition, and this coalition won't be able to govern on its own. So I think what we will see is more a compromise, and at EU level it will be more France not reforming, not addressing this deficit and debt problem. So it will be a problem in itself, but it's not like when Tsipras and Varoufakis came into government in Greece.
We all remember those days.
So I think we have to keep cool heads, waiting for what happens. Of course, it won't be easy, but it's not the disaster that some are fearing.
And as we said here, obviously all the capitals have been reacting, and one tweet that stood out, in fact, last Sunday night came from Poland, from the Prime Minister Donald Tusk. He said, in Paris there's enthusiasm, in Moscow disappointment, in Kyiv relief, enough to be happy in Warsaw. Did that kind of represent a little bit how you were also feeling?
Yeah, I mean, there is definitely relief, but that's why I mentioned at the beginning, there are two big problems still outstanding, and one is irresponsible government, but I agree with Eric, the extreme left, I think, will not make it into government. The forces around the centre, centre-right, centre-left, will have to come together in one form or another. But there's also the problem of unstable government. So just to focus on Le Pen didn't make it and now everything is all right, I think is very wrong. But I think the president now has understood he needs to give the country and the politicians a little bit of time to come together, because since 1958, the right and the left never had to compromise. It's something very new.
Fascinating times in France, and we will keep a very close eye on them and bring you up to speed on the 18th of July when we get more. But for now, thank you so much to our guests for being with us. Stay with us here, though, on Euronews, because shortly we'll be hearing if the outcome of elections in the United Kingdom could bring about a better Brexit deal for the UK. Stay with us. Welcome back to Brussels, my love. I'm Maeve McMahon, along with my panel, Claes Vella, Maria Tadeo and Eric Maurice. We're just breaking down the news of the week. And of course, the stories dominating our screens this week were the horrific bombings in Kyiv and, of course, the diplomatic efforts to stop the war at the NATO summit in Washington, D.C. But actually, what we want to zoom into is this: the new political landscape in the United Kingdom. After 14 years of conservatism, the British have swung to the left. The UK Labour Party won 412 of the 650 seats in the 4th of July general elections. European leaders were thrilled and sent messages of encouragement to the new Prime Minister, Keir Starmer. How was this outcome viewed from Brussels, Maria? No major changes, I guess.
No major changes. And to me, this is a story where basically the way that this is approached from the UK is extremely important. Brexit is still a story that hugely matters and will shape the country for many decades to come. I was, however, surprised that it didn't feature in the election. Nobody wanted to mention the word. But I think when you look at the EU institutions and you look at the European sort of public opinion, this feels like Brexit happened a long, long time ago. Why are we even debating this, where you have a war going on in this continent and all of these issues are affecting the European member states, the EU member states. So I think the way that this is approached is completely different. You mentioned before, will a new government get to a better deal? I think that debate, we just need to put it to rest. I mean, a deal is a deal. This whole idea of a new deal, that will not happen. And I hope that that is clear to everyone. But I would say also the relationships to some extent, they had gotten better over the past year already. We saw that there was this idea of let's get together. The deal is done. Now let's try to approach things with the parameters that we have fixed.
So after that nasty divorce, indeed, as you say, relations were getting better. But we did see the UK Foreign Minister, David Lammy, he took off to Germany, Poland and Sweden already to show some love for continental Europe. And I think the trip went down very well over in Germany. Are we entering like another era here for even more blossoming love and friendship between London and Brussels?
I think we've definitely reached now the end of bitterness. We are starting something much more constructive. Still with limitations, but it is absolutely evident that they want to put the relationship onto a new footing. And I also believe they will need to, because they need to regenerate some growth. And their calculations that Brexit made Britain lose about £40 billion, which is enormous. Labour has won a landslide, but with a very weak percentage result. If they cannot come back to growth in this term, they will be in serious trouble. And the only way back to growth is, in fact, stronger cooperation with the European Union.
Well, we wanted to also hear how people in the UK think whether or not this would bring about a new friendship after that painful divorce. So we had a chat with David Hennick. He's the director of the UK Trade Policy Project.
No EU relationship with a neighbouring country is entirely straightforward. So I can imagine little bursts of troubles here and there. But the generalised hostility that existed, the difficulties that the EU had with a particular UK government and a particular approach, at least for the time being, those have gone. You have a UK that really wants to make this relationship work and will put in some effort to doing that. That being said, it still won't automatically understand the EU. The UK has long had a problem with understanding the EU. It's not entirely clear the EU will fully understand the UK. So I think that there will be lots of frustrations. The hostility may have gone, but the tensions may carry on in various ways.
David Hennig there stating that the UK has never understood the EU and vice versa. Eric Maurice, would you agree with that? And also, do you miss the UK around here?
Do I? Not really, myself. I think a lot of things changed since the Brexit vote. A lot of things were done by the EU, and we know that it would have been more difficult with the UK in terms of economy, in terms of response to COVID and to all the challenges. But what is good with this election is that I think there is no big expectations and no excessive expectations. We know the new UK government won't try to get to come back to the EU. So
what about the single market? I mean,
they say they are clear: no single market, no custom unions, no free movement. So at least we know they are not going to put the EU in a difficult situation and position where we would have to look at what they ask and what we can give them. They just want to improve the relations, especially on trade, so mitigate the effect of Brexit, and also look at what was absent, what was not in the agreement, and which is very important in terms of common interest. It's security in relation to Ukraine, but also climate and economic
plays
security.
Already a major role there. But just on the opening of the single market or getting back into it, that's what voters wanted. But would the EU allow for that?
I don't think that Britain can go back to pick and choose. And they don't want to do the whole package. So I personally expect that there will be a lot of initiative to come close on security and defense, especially defense procurement, which is something which is welcome because we need additional capacity. And I would also expect that they want to have a new arrangement on veterinary rules because that's making border regimes very, very difficult. I think that's the first, but I believe that once the legislature goes on, they will come under increasing pressure to produce growth. And there the more fundamental questions come on the table, because it's a very weak mandate. Let's not forget that the new Prime Minister had less votes, a smaller percentage than Jeremy Corbyn, who was perceived as extremist and failing as leader. So in fact, they have been very successful because the vote was split between the Conservatives and the Reform Party.
Yeah, and I think to your point where you said when it comes to a single market, this idea of cherry picking, I think that was put to rest many years already ago. I think this government, you would think, and the people, frankly, around the Prime Minister, I think they understand it and they get it. The worst thing they could do now is to get back to Brussels with an idea of let's get a better deal. By now it is understood the deal is a deal. It's different to talk about the implementation and the mitigation of some of the issues that are fair, but to go back into potentially reopening a deal, that would be terrible. The other issue I would say is if you come to Brussels, and this was a huge mistake also that happened repeatedly with a number of UK Prime Ministers, thinking perhaps you could divide the different member states, that you could reach out to a country, not another one, that also doesn't work. But again, I think what changes now fundamentally is that the mood has changed, but the government and the people around the Prime Minister, I think they really understand, and they have learned from a number of different mistakes that that approach doesn't work. And we've seen it already yesterday and in the past couple of days that there is really now a way of, okay, the end of hostilities here. Let's try to reset the relationship in a number of ways, but the parameters are clear.
End of hostilities, end of bitterness, and trust is back on the table, which is also good. But that point brings this conversation to an end. Thank you so much to our guests for being with us and for your insights. And thank you so much for watching. Take care and see you soon on Euronews. Welcome back to Brussels, my love. I'm Maeve McMahon. Now, despite the busy news schedule, let's not forget it's summer. So it's almost time to go on holiday, if of course you can afford it. And according to the European Travel Commission, we're back to pre-COVID travel here in the European Union. And 75% of us have planned a trip this summer. That's up from 6% from last year. And seemingly air travel is our favourite way to travel still inside the European Union, followed by taking the car, that's second at 28%, and then train remains stable there, it's the third at 10%. So first question, are you planning on taking a trip this summer, and what will you be thinking about when you go on holidays?
I will be thinking about having a nice time, close to the beach but not on the beach. I will not be air traveling because I always go to northern France because there my head is a little bit less exposed to the sun, which has become increasingly important.
It is. What about you? Is climate change something you think about when you're travelling now?
Well, I'm travelling to France, so not far away. But
very proud Frenchman.
Yeah. But yeah, climate change. I mean, taking a plane just for a weekend, it's something I do less, of course.
What about you?
Well, I'm not trying to be politically correct, but I have not planned, so I cannot tell you whether it's by plane, sea, skies, or the airs. But, it's a question that's actually to me very relevant. This idea of the plane and the train, it is, it seems a lighthearted question, but there's also a lot of politics built into this. And if you look at the European elections, just very briefly, and again, I hate to be very serious, let's go back into the politics, but this is a real sort of cultural lightning rod for a lot of people. And you do see that there is pushback from a part of society that believes you are not going to force me into a train. I just don't accept it. Obviously the flip side to this, and I think you have to see this in the broader context of the Green Deal, is that those politics can affect the mood, the implementation of it. And you see now there is a real question as to whether or not there's too much ideology built into green. Of course, a supporter of climate policies and science, of course, will tell you this debate is completely absurd. And by now the numbers and the figures speak for themselves. But there is something very political about the question is it a train or a plane this summer?
And that's why Greenpeace as well have been looking into this and telling us that the infrastructure is just not there. They said they researched 990 routes between 45 major countries and only 114 routes are served by direct trains. So it's just not possible. But we wanted to hear more on priorities for European travels this summer. So I actually visited the Complas of Brussels to have a chat with the director of the European Travel Commission. That's Eduardo Santander.
Well, believe it or not, safety is still one of the main factors for decision-making when it comes to choose where to go. These days, I think it's a little bit a reminiscence still of the pandemic, in a sense that people are looking not only for a good experience, but also to feel better than at home. And that means that a lot of requirements have to be met, mainly, of course, things related to safety while traveling, but also at destination. Things like heat waves and obviously weather-related events are taking more and more importance when it comes to book a holiday. But nevertheless, there is an increase of interest in lesser-known destinations, northern cooler destinations, and this is something that we have to observe and monitor for the years to come.
Eduardo Santander there from the European Travel Commission telling us that tourism is thriving, but obviously our unstable world and climate change playing a role. Maybe a comment from you to finish there on the trains. I mean, even in Germany, they don't even work.
They might be a little bit late.
Twice too late.
I recently could spend some time in Japan, and they are 60 seconds. It's a catastrophe.
They're amazing there. In Japan, they're incredible. When will we ever get to where Japan is? I mean, we know we have the report on the Enrique Letta report with all these dreamy plans about making infrastructure great again here.
Yeah, well, I think that's an ambition that we have had for a long time. It costs money, and we know investment is a problem in the EU. Where to find the money, and so we are back to politics. It's capital markets union and budget flexibility and so on. So far from the holidays.
And of course, as Maria also said, everything goes back to politics. But this conclusion brings our discussion to an end. Thank you so much, Klaus Welle, for being with us, Maria Tadeo,
so much,
and Eric Maurice for being our guest this weekend. If you've any comments for us or any stories you want us to take a look at, do reach out. brusselsmylove@euronews.com is our email address. You can also direct message us on social media. But in the meantime, take care and see you soon.